In a single, violent night, an entire ancient kingdom lost 3,000 sacred treasures, each one deeply tied to its unique history, power, and spiritual identity. These masterpieces were not simply lost or accidentally destroyed, but were deliberately seized and quietly transported across the dark ocean into unfamiliar, foreign hands. What followed was never officially labeled as a theft, but was instead given a strategic name carefully designed to sound both justified and morally necessary. But behind that clinical name was the reality of fire, gunpowder, and a thriving city brought to absolute silence while its people watched everything sacred being taken. More than a full century later, those same stolen pieces are still sitting behind cold glass cases, thousands of miles away from the soil where they truly belong. This is our deep investigation into what really happened during that night of fire, and the uncomfortable truth of why those treasures have never been returned. To understand the sheer magnitude of what was taken, we must first reconstruct the sophisticated world that existed before the smoke and the fire. Benin City was the heart of a powerful empire that had flourished for over 400 years as a global center of trade and artistry. The royal palace was a sprawling masterpiece of architecture, where every pillar was adorned with bronze plaques that acted as a visual library for a nation. These were not merely decorative objects. They were sacred historical records, capturing the soul of a civilization in metal, ivory, and vibrant red coral. The level of artistic mastery was so high that later Western experts would be left in a state of absolute, stunned disbelief at their perfection. They desperately invented myths of foreign influence, refusing to admit that the geniuses behind the bronze were the very African people they intended to conquer. Beneath the surface of the city, master casers used the complex lost wax technique, a process so precise it remains a benchmark for metallurgical sophistication today. By early 1897, this concentrated wealth of history sat quietly inside the palace walls, unaware of the massive colonial machine grinding toward its gates. Behind closed doors in London, military strategists were already drafting the blueprints for an invasion, cloaking their hunger for territory in respectable diplomatic language. The official trigger was a violent clash involving a British party, but investigative historians have uncovered a much darker timeline of planned colonial provocation. The true motivation lay in the hidden ledger books. Benin held the keys to the most lucrative trade routes, and the British Empire wanted total control. In the humid heat of February, 1,200 heavily armed British soldiers began their slow, silent encirclement of a city about to be erased from time. What followed was not a battle, but a brutal execution of colonial policy that would leave a permanent, bleeding scar on the entire African continent. The sky turned black as British forces began the systematic incineration of the city, moving building by building to ensure nothing of the old world remained. The royal palace, the architectural crown jewel of West Africa, became a furnace where centuries of sacred tradition were consumed by the hunger of colonial fire. The human cost was staggering, with reports suggesting that 10,000 souls were lost in the chaos, their lives discarded in the pursuit of a British lesson. While the embers were still glowing, soldiers ignored the dying and the displaced, funneling into the ruins with a single, focused objective: strip the palace bare. They pried the historic bronze plaques from the scorched walls and seized the ivory tusks, treating the sacred regalia of the Oba like common battlefield loot. Thousands of priceless objects were unceremoniously shoved into wooden shipping crates, a frantic attempt to stabilize the stolen goods before they were sent across the ocean. As the ships pulled away from the coast, the horizon carried away the physical memory of a people, leaving behind a hollowed city and a stolen future. Upon arrival in London, these sacred objects didn't go to a hall of learning. They were wheeled into the cold, commercial atmosphere of an elite auction house. The expedition had been a costly military venture, and the British government viewed these stolen masterpieces as the liquid assets required to balance their books. In the summer of 1897, the prestigious Christie's auction house became the site of a historic crime as sacred African art was sold for gold. Private collectors and national museums scrambled for a piece of the loot, effectively laundering the theft into the respectable world of highbrow international art collecting. Within months, the soul of Benin was scattered across the globe, hidden away in the vaults of Germany, the halls of America, and the United Kingdom. The British Museum became the primary beneficiary of the violence, absorbing hundreds of pieces often donated by the very soldiers who had physically looted the palace. Institutions in Berlin and Vienna raced to build their own African collections, using the spoils of the massacre to establish themselves as centers of global culture. To soothe the public conscience, a narrative was crafted that these objects were being rescued from a barbaric culture, a lie that has persisted for decades. It is a bitter irony that the British claimed to be saving the art from destruction, while they were the ones who set the city ablaze. History was rewritten in real time as the looters posed for photographs with their stolen goods, framing themselves as explorers rather than perpetrators of a massive heist. Even as they marveled at the craftsmanship, European academics continued to peddle the myth that such sophistication could never have originated from a West African artist. They searched for any alternative explanation, reaching for Egyptian or Portuguese ghosts rather than acknowledging the indigenous brilliance sitting right in front of their prejudiced eyes. By denying the origin of the art, they were attempting to strip the Benin people of their humanity, justifying the theft by claiming the creators were unworthy. And so, for over a century, these bronzes sat in sterile silence, disconnected from their purpose and their people, serving as trophies for the empires that stole them. Fast forward to today, and the crime scene remains largely undisturbed, with the vast majority of the looted treasures sitting exactly where the British looters left them. The British Museum remains the fortress of this controversy, guarding over 900 stolen objects while avoiding any real conversation about their permanent and rightful return. Across Europe, the numbers remain staggering. German institutions hold over 1,000 pieces, while Austrian vaults contain nearly 200 remnants of the ancient empire. The trail of the heist extends into the United States, where prestigious universities continue to display artifacts that were born of fire and systemic colonial violence. If you walk into Gallery 25 of the British Museum right now, you are standing in a room built on the documented theft of a sovereign nation's heritage. Look closely at the labels. They use the term Benin Expedition, a clever linguistic shield designed to hide the reality of a massacre from the modern public eye. Since Nigeria gained its independence, the call for the return of these souls has never ceased. Yet Western museums have spent decades building walls of legal resistance. The excuses have evolved over the years, from claiming Nigeria lacks proper storage to the arrogant suggestion that these works belong to a vague world heritage. But the core of their argument hasn't changed since 1897. It is the lingering belief that Europe is a better guardian of African history than Africa. It is a circular logic that uses the initial act of theft to justify the ongoing possession, suggesting that the victim is not responsible enough to hold property. And so, the bronzes remain trapped behind glass in cities like London, Berlin, and Vienna, far removed from the tropical sun and the soil of their birth. They are artifacts without air, disconnected from the living ceremonies and the royal lineage they were cast to protect, serving only as decorative reminders of a past. But the tide of history is finally starting to turn, and it isn't because the museums found a conscience. It's because the world is finally demanding a true ending. A new generation of digital activists and Nigerian historians are refusing to let the trail go cold, using global pressure to force a conversation that can't be ignored. In a landmark move in 2021, Germany finally admitted the truth and began the slow process of returning portions of their stolen Benin collections home. The Smithsonian in America followed suit in 2022, returning 29 objects and acknowledging that the ethics of the past are no longer acceptable in the present. Even the storied halls of Oxford and Cambridge have begun to crumble, with both universities committing to the return of their looted bronzes after a century of silence. Yet the British Museum stands as the final holdout, hiding behind outdated legal restrictions to avoid facing the reality that their most famous gallery is a house of stolen goods. The pressure is reaching a breaking point because the truth of 1897 is too loud to be muffled by museum euphemisms or polished glass display cases. The heist of the Benin Bronzes remains one of the most thoroughly documented crimes in history, and until the art is returned, the case remains wide open and unresolved. 3,000 masterpieces were taken by force, scattered across a world that didn't understand them, and now the long journey back to Benin City has officially begun. This is just one file in a massive cabinet of colonial theft. There are thousands more stories of erased histories and stolen legacies finally coming into the light.